Arya Beaumont felt the weight of the off-shoulder burgundy gown long before she reached the ballroom doors. It was a dress that didn't fit her spirit, satin and soft. Exactly as Cameron Price had demanded in the note he'd left pinned to her closet 3 weeks prior. At 28, Arya had mastered the art of picking her battles, and tonight, with the glitter of Manhattan's elite reflecting in the floor-to-ceiling windows of the pier, a dress didn't seem worth the argument. She believed the night was a celebration of their shared future, a coronation for the man she had helped build from the ground up. As her heels clicked against the marble entryway, the campaign staffer's greeting was the first crack in the foundation. He offered a professional smile that never reached his eyes, informing her that the party was already seated. The phrasing was clinical, devoid of the warmth usually reserved for a candidate's fiancé. He guided her through the sea of designer labels and diamonds toward the second row, the row for associates and staff, far from the podium where Cameron stood bathed in spotlights. High above the crowd, Cameron Price looked every bit the future mayor, but he wasn't alone. Standing in the space Arya had occupied for 3 years was Genevieve Sterling, the heiress to a multi-billion-dollar construction empire. Genevieve's smile was sharp, a weapon honed by 4 generations of old money. The room fell into a practiced silence as Cameron leaned into the microphone. He looked out over the 200 guests, his gaze skimming over Arya as if she were just another face in the crowd. "Arya, I'm glad you could make it," he said, his voice amplified and echoing through the hall. The words were a public execution of her dignity, stripping her of her title and her history in a single, cold sentence. Arya didn't move toward the empty chair in the second row. She stood 3 feet from the stage, her breath hitching as she realized the microphones were live, the cameras were rolling, and her humiliation was being broadcast to the very people who had spent years treating her like a silent prop. "Cameron, what is this?" Her voice rang out, steadier than the trembling in her hands. Cameron's expression remained carefully neutral, the mask of a seasoned politician. He gestured dismissively to the associate's chair. "Please, sit, Arya. There's an announcement you need to hear." She didn't sit. In that moment, as the elite of Manhattan watched her fall, Arya Beaumont realized that the foundation of her life hadn't just cracked, it had been demolished. "Hello, family. Nice to have you on here. Before we proceed with the story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comment and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here. Now let's proceed with the story." The cold Manhattan rain didn't just fall, it punished. Arya Beaumont stood on the curb outside the pier, her thin heels sinking into the grimy slush of the gutter. The burgundy satin gown, which had felt like a cage inside the ballroom, now felt like a second skin of ice. Behind her, the muffled roar of the fundraiser continued, the sound of champagne flutes clinking and the rhythmic applause for Cameron Price's new life. To the 200 elite guests inside, Arya had become a ghost before she even left the room. She didn't cry. The shock had bypassed tears and gone straight to a hollow, vibrating ache in her chest. Every flash of a passing taxi's headlights felt like a camera shutter, a reminder of the viral humiliation that was likely already circulating on social media. She was a lead structural engineer who had spent years calculating the load-bearing capacity of skyscrapers, yet she hadn't seen the structural failure of her own life until the roof caved in. A black town car swerved too close to the curb, sending a spray of freezing gray water over her hem. Arya didn't even flinch. She felt untethered, a nameless woman in an expensive dress with nowhere to go and no one to call. Her phone was in her clutch, likely buzzing with sympathy, texts from people who had never liked her, but she couldn't bring herself to touch it. Then the rain stopped. Not all of it, but the weight of it suddenly vanished from her shoulders. Arya looked up, expecting to see a sympathetic doorman, but instead, she found herself enveloped in a shadow deeper than the New York night. A broad, black umbrella held steady above her, creating a private sanctuary of dry pavement in the middle of the storm. "The rain in this city has no respect for beauty," a voice remarked. It was a low, resonant baritone with a melodic undercurrent, a voice that sounded like silk dragged over gravel. Arya turned slowly. Standing beside her was a man who seemed to have stepped out of a different, more dangerous world. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling a tailored black wool coat that screamed quiet, lethal wealth. His hair was slicked back, dark and precise, framing a face defined by a sharp jawline and eyes so focused they felt like a physical weight. On the side of his neck, a sliver of ink peeked out from his collar, the tail of a dragon that disappeared into the shadows of his shirt. This was not a politician. This was Seo Min-hyuk. Arya knew the name from the hushed whispers of the architectural firms she worked for. He was the man people called the Dragon of Seoul, a mogul whose legitimate construction empire was rumored to be the iron fist inside a very dark velvet glove. "I don't need pity," Arya whispered, her voice cracking despite her best efforts to remain stoic. "Pity is for the weak," Min-hyuk replied, his dark eyes scanning her face with a clinical, intense interest. He didn't look at her with the condescending sympathy she had seen on the faces inside the ballroom. He looked at her as if he were inspecting a diamond that had been tossed into a trash heap. "I am offering protection. There is a difference." He stepped closer, the scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco cutting through the smell of wet asphalt. The heat radiating from his body was the first warmth Arya had felt in hours. "I watched the broadcast," he said, nodding toward the glowing windows of the ballroom above. "Cameron Price is a man who builds on sand. He just threw away the only foundation that was holding him up. That was his mistake. I do not make mistakes." Arya shivered, her breath hitching in the cold air. "What do you want, Mr. Seo?" "I have a project," he said, his gaze dropping briefly to her shivering hands before returning to her eyes. "A legacy project that requires an engineer who isn't afraid of the dark, someone who knows how to make a structure stand when the world wants it to fall. In exchange, I will give you a name that no one in this city dares to whisper, let alone humiliate." He reached out, his hand, covered in a black leather glove, offering a silent invitation. It was a transactional offer, a contract signed in the rain, but as Arya looked into his unwavering eyes, she realized that the monster in front of her was the only person who had actually seen her all night. She looked back at the pier one last time. Cameron was in there, laughing and shaking hands, having traded her for a political shadow. She looked back at Min-hyuk, the man who lived in the shadows but offered her the sun. Slowly, Arya reached out and placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, possessive, and absolute. "Take me away from here," she said. Min-hyuk didn't smile, but the intensity in his eyes flared. He guided her toward a waiting obsidian-black limousine that sat idling like a predator at the curb. As the door opened, shielding her from the prying eyes of Manhattan, Arya Beaumont realized she wasn't just escaping a party. She was stepping into a world where the rules were written in ink and blood, and for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't afraid of the collapse. The transition from the freezing chaos of the Manhattan streets to the interior of Seo Min-hyuk's estate was like stepping into a different dimension of reality. The obsidian limousine glided through a set of reinforced iron gates in Upper Westchester, passing through layers of security that made Cameron's, high-stakes, political events look like child's play. Arya watched the world through the tinted glass, her fingers still numb. Beside her, Min-hyuk remained a silent, steady presence, his silhouette cut from the shadows. When the car finally stopped before a sprawling structure of glass, steel, and dark stone, Arya realized this wasn't just a home. It was a fortress. The interior was a masterclass in brutalist elegance. High ceilings, polished concrete floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Hudson River, though the glass was clearly thick enough to stop a high-caliber round. Min-hyuk led her past several men in sharp suits who bowed with military precision as he passed. He didn't stop until they reached a wing of the house that smelled of ozone and expensive paper. "This is your wing," Min-hyuk said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. Arya looked around. She had expected a gilded cage, a bedroom filled with silk and jewelry to play the part of a trophy wife. Instead, she found a state-of-the-art drafting studio. Massive tilted desks, high-resolution monitors displaying 3D structural models, and shelves lined with engineering journals and soil density reports. It was a mirror of her office at the firm, but better. "I don't understand," Arya whispered, her hand hovering over a specialized haptic stylus. "Cameron told the world I was just his support system. He said my degree was a nice accessory for a politician's wife." Min-hyuk stepped into the light, and for the first time, Arya saw the full extent of the tattoos on his hands, intricate, dark patterns that suggested a history written in ink and fire. He picked up a set of blueprints from the center table and unrolled them. Cameron Price is a fool who tried to build a skyscraper on a foundation of ego, Min Hyuk said, his dark eyes fixing on hers. I am building a legacy. This is the new Seoul Trade District, a $20 billion infrastructure project in the heart of the city. My rivals want it to fail. They have bribed the inspectors and tampered with the materials. He leaned over the table, his muscular frame casting a long shadow over the blueprints. I didn't bring you here to stand on my arm at galas, Arya. I brought you here because I've read your thesis on seismic dampening in high-density urban environments. I brought you here because you see the cracks in a structure before the first brick is laid. Arya felt a strange, electric jolt through her chest. For years, she had been a soft presence in burgundy satin, a silent partner to a man who didn't know the difference between a load-bearing wall and a curtain wall. Now, a man the world feared was looking at her as a tactical asset. You want me to audit your projects, she realized, her voice gaining a strength it hadn't possessed all night. I want you to be the brain of this operation, Min Hyuk corrected. My men know how to handle the streets. They know how to handle the physical threats. But they don't know how to spot a fraudulent stress test or a compromised steel beam. You do. You will be my ghost architect. You will find the weaknesses my enemies are hiding, and in return, I will provide the power to erase the people who tried to destroy you. He slid a black folder across the table. Inside was a legal contract, but not a marriage certificate. It was a high-level consultancy agreement with a retainer that made her previous salary look like pocket change. At the bottom was a second document, a non-disclosure agreement with a Seal Arya recognized as a private security firm. The Hallstroms and the Prices think you are a discarded woman wandering in the rain, Min Hyuk murmured, stepping closer until she could feel the heat of his presence. Let them think that. While they celebrate their victory, you will be under my protection, dismantling the very world they think they own. Arya looked at the blueprints, then at the man standing before her. He was a monster by reputation, a leader of a world she didn't understand. But as she looked at the drafting table, she realized he had given her the one thing Cameron never could, a sense of purpose. I'll need access to the site's historical soil reports and the last 3 months of the material procurement logs, Arya said, her mind already shifting into professional gear. A flicker of something resembling a smile touched Min Hyuk's lips. It was a cold, sharp expression, but it held a glimmer of genuine respect. Everything is already on your server, he replied. Welcome to the family, Arya. Tonight, you stop being a victim. Tomorrow, you become the architect of their downfall. As Arya sat at the desk, the burgundy dress finally feeling like a costume she was ready to shed, she realized that the infrastructure of power wasn't just about the buildings Min Hyuk owned. It was about the man himself, and the fact that he was the first person to realize that her brain was the most dangerous weapon in the room. The clock on the drafting studio wall blurred past 3:00 a.m., the only sound in the room being the low hum of the high-performance servers and the rhythmic scratching of Arya's stylus. She had shed the burgundy gown hours ago, replaced by an oversized gray sweatshirt and leggings she'd found in the suite's wardrobe, her hair piled into a messy, voluminous crown. Her eyes ached from staring at the procurement logs for the new Seoul Trade District, but the data was finally screaming the truth she had suspected. The load-bearing columns for the primary tower were being forged with substandard carbon steel. The heavy oak door creaked open, and a shadow stretched across her workstation. Arya didn't jump. She had grown used to the silent, predatory grace of the house's master. Min Hyuk entered without his tailored blazer, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar and sleeves rolled up to his elbows. In the harsh glow of the LED desk lamps, the tattoos Arya had only caught glimpses of were now fully revealed. Intricate black ink crawled up his forearms, not just the scales of a dragon, but traditional Korean landscapes, crashing waves, and script that looked like ancient poetry. They were a map of a life lived in the trenches of power, a sharp contrast to the pristine, sterile image Cameron had always cultivated. You're still awake, Min Hyuk noted, placing a heavy crystal glass of amber liquid on the edge of her table. He didn't offer her a drink. He offered her a plate of sliced fruit and dark chocolate, a silent acknowledgement that she needed fuel, not intoxication. "The numbers don't lie, Min Hyuk," Arya said, her voice raspy from hours of silence. She tapped the screen, highlighting a series of stress test anomalies. "The supplier for your steel beams, Dongsun Metals. They're skimming. They're providing grade 50 steel but billing you for grade 65. If you build to the height specified in these plans, the foundation will shear under the lateral wind loads within 5 years." Min Hyuk leaned over her, his chest inches from her shoulder. The scent of sandalwood and something metallic, perhaps the scent of the city or the steel he dealt in, enveloped her. He didn't look at the screen immediately. He looked at her. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way her warm brown skin looked under the blue light of the monitors. "I suspected as much," he murmured, his eyes finally shifting to the data. "Dongsun has been a loyal partner for a decade. Loyalty is the currency of my world, Arya. To find out it has been devalued is irritating." "It's more than irritating. It's a massacre waiting to happen," Arya countered, turning in her chair to face him. Her movement brought her closer than she intended. She could see the fine lines of fatigue around his eyes and the way a particular tattoo, a small, delicate lotus, rested just behind his ear, hidden by the sharp line of his hair. "Whoever authorized this isn't just stealing money. They're trying to bury you under the rubble of your own legacy." Min Hyuk reached out, his hand hovering near the blueprints. His fingers were long and steady, the ink on his knuckles spelling out words in a language Arya couldn't read, but the strength behind them was universal. For a moment, the death god of the tabloids was gone, replaced by a man who looked genuinely weary of the shadows. "My world is built on the idea that strength is the only constant," Min Hyuk said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Cameron Price wanted you to be a soft ornament because he is a weak man who fears anything he cannot control. But I have enough soldiers, Arya. I have enough monsters. What I have never had is a partner who can see the cracks before they break me." Arya felt a strange heat rise in her chest that had nothing to do with the studio's climate control. For 3 years, she had been Cameron's support, a role that required her to be invisible. Min Hyuk was asking for her to be his sight. He was looking at her with a raw, dangerous honesty, his ink-stained skin inches from her own. "Is that why you saved me?" she asked. "Because you needed an auditor." Min Hyuk stepped back, but the intensity didn't leave his gaze. He traced the edge of a tattoo on his wrist, a heavy shackled design that seemed to disappear into his palm. "I saved you because I recognized the look in your eyes on that curb. It was the look of a structure that had been sabotaged from the inside. I don't like seeing beautiful things collapse due to poor engineering." He straightened his shirt, the Mafia boss mask sliding back into place as he prepared to leave the room. "Sleep, Arya. Tomorrow. We begin the deconstruction of Dongsun Metals, and after that, we look into Cameron's connection to the supplier. I suspect your ex-fiancé's political campaign is being funded by the very steel that was meant to kill me." As the door closed behind him, Arya looked back at the blueprints. She felt the weight of the task ahead, but for the first time, she didn't feel like a victim of the storm. She felt like the one who controlled the lightning. She looked at her own hands, small and brown against the white paper, and realized they were finally building something that mattered. The skyline of Manhattan glittered with a cold, unforgiving light, but inside the Metropolitan Museum's Temple of Dendur, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of lilies and the hum of power. This was the Sterling Foundation Gala, the ultimate victory lap for Cameron Price and his new partner in both business and bed, Genevieve Sterling. Arya Beaumont stood at the entrance, her hand resting on the crook of CO Min Hyuk's arm. She wasn't wearing burgundy tonight. She was draped in a custom-made gown of midnight blue silk that clung to her curves like liquid metal. The deep, warm brown of her skin glowed against the cool fabric, and her voluminous curls were swept back, revealing diamond drops that caught the light with every move. Beside her, Min Hyuk was a vision of lethal elegance. His black tuxedo was tailored to perfection, the silk lapels mirroring the sharp precision of his jawline. The dragon tattoo on his neck was partially visible above his crisp white collar, a silent warning to anyone who dared to stare too long. Remember, Min Hyuk murmured, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. They think you are a ghost. Show them you are the architect of their haunting. As they stepped onto the marble floor, the rhythmic chatter of the room faltered. It started near the entrance and spread like a wildfire, a wave of silence that followed them as they moved toward the center of the hall. This was the elite's playground, a place where Arya had spent years being invisible. Now, she was the gravitational center of the room. Cameron stood near the champagne fountain, his arm draped possessively around Genevieve's waist. He was mid-laugh, basking in the attention of a group of city council members, when his eyes landed on Arya. The glass in his hand tilted dangerously. His jaw didn't just drop, it froze. The smug, polished mask he wore for the cameras shattered, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. Beside him, Genevieve's sharp smile vanished. Her eyes darted from Arya's radiant confidence to the man standing beside her. Everyone in the room knew who Seo Min Hyuk was, and they knew he didn't do dates. He did alliances. He did conquests. Arya didn't wait for them to approach. She led Min Hyuk directly toward them, her stride graceful and unhurried. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. "Cameron," Arya said, her voice smooth and devoid of the tremor that had defined her for years. "Genevieve, it's a lovely party. The structural integrity of this wing has always been fascinating, much sturdier than some of the newer projects going up in the city." Cameron's face turned a mottled shade of red. "Arya, what? What are you doing here? And with?" He trailed off, his gaze flicking nervously to Min Hyuk. Min Hyuk stepped forward, his presence expanding to fill the space between them. He didn't offer a hand to shake. He simply looked down at Cameron with a cold, predatory detachment. "I don't believe we've been introduced, Mr. Price. I am Seo Min Hyuk, but you likely know me as the man who just acquired the primary debt on your campaign headquarters." The silence in their immediate circle became absolute. Cameron's eyes widened, his throat working as he tried to find words that wouldn't fail him. He looked at Arya, his expression shifting from shock to a desperate, ugly realization. The soft woman he had discarded on a rainy curb was gone. In her place stood a woman who held the keys to his financial ruin. "You're with him," Genevieve hissed, her voice lashing out like a cornered animal. "Do you have any idea who this man is, Arya? He's a criminal. He is a man who recognizes a solid foundation," Arya interrupted, her eyes locking onto Genevieve, with a ferocity that made the heiress flinch. "Which is more than I can say for the Sterling Price merger. I've had a look at the blueprints for your new waterfront development, Genevieve. You might want to check the stress load calculations on those grade 50 steel beams. It would be a shame if your legacy collapsed before the ribbon cutting." The blood drained from Genevieve's face. She looked at Cameron, whose frantic expression confirmed her worst fears. They had thought Arya was a silent witness to their corruption. They hadn't realized she was the only one who knew where the bodies and the faulty steel were buried. Min Hyuk placed a hand on the small of Arya's back, a gesture that was both protective and deeply possessive. "We have other guests to greet, darling," he said, his eyes never leaving Cameron. "The mayor is waiting for your thoughts on the new bridge project." As they turned and walked away, the room erupted into a feverish hum of whispers. Arya didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of Cameron's gaze on her, heavy with the bitter taste of regret. For years, she had been his support beam, the invisible strength that kept his life from buckling. Now, she was the force that was going to bring it all down. "You did well," Min Hyuk whispered as they reached the far side of the room. "I'm just getting started," Arya replied, a small, dangerous smile playing on her full lips. She looked up at him, seeing the man beneath the ink, and for the first time, she realized that the reckoning wasn't just about revenge. It was about finally standing on ground that was entirely her own. The high society victory at the gala had provided a temporary rush, but back within the silent, silver-lit confines of Min Hyuk's drafting studio, the reality of the situation was far more visceral. Arya sat surrounded by the glowing screens of her workstation, the midnight blue silk of her gala gown replaced by a simple cotton shirt. She was digging into the digital bones of the Sterling Price, waterfront revitalization, project, Cameron's supposed political masterpiece. As a structural engineer, Arya understood that buildings told the truth when people wouldn't. She began cross-referencing the architectural renderings with the actual procurement orders she had intercepted through Min Hyuk's network. What she found made her blood run cold. The blueprints promised a revolutionary, floating garden spire, a massive glass and steel structure that would redefine the Manhattan skyline. But the math was a lie. Arya stared at the lateral load calculations for the central core. Cameron and the Sterlings had authorized a cost-saving measure that swapped high-tensile steel for a cheaper, brittle composite. On paper, it met the minimum code. In reality, a sustained windstorm off the Atlantic would turn the skyscraper into a vertical graveyard. The door to the studio slid open. Min Hyuk walked in, his presence immediately grounding the frantic energy of the room. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate ink of a sprawling dragon that seemed to pulse under the dim lights. He stood behind her, his hands resting on the back of her chair. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he murmured, his voice a low, soothing vibration. "Worse," Arya replied, her fingers flying across the keyboard to pull up a stress-simulated heat map. "I've seen a murder plot. Min Hyuk, this isn't just poor engineering, it's a hollowed-out shell. Look at the ledger for the foundation pouring." She pointed to the discrepancies. Millions of dollars were being billed for high-grade concrete that was never delivered. Instead, the logs showed a shell company based in the Caymans, one tied directly to Cameron's campaign fund, swallowing the difference. "They aren't building a landmark," Arya said, her voice trembling with a mixture of professional fury and personal disgust. "They're using the construction site as a massive laundry machine for dark money. They're skimming 70% of the material costs and replacing the structural integrity with prayers. If this building reaches the 40th floor, the base will shear. It's a death trap, Min Hyuk, a literal glass and steel tomb for anyone inside." Min Hyuk leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the data. The scent of sandalwood and cold rain clung to him. He didn't look surprised, he looked lethal. "Cameron is more desperate than I realized. He's not just trying to win an election, he's trying to pay off the people who own him. The Sterlings are providing the cover, and he's providing the signatures." He straightened, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. One hand moved to Arya's shoulder, his thumb brushing the line of her collarbone in a gesture that was both possessive and grounding. "This is the crack in their foundation, Arya. Not just the building, but their souls. They think they can bury their crimes in the concrete." "We have to stop it," Arya insisted, turning to look up at him. "If that building goes up, people will die." "We won't just stop it," Min Hyuk corrected, his dark eyes burning with a terrifying, focused intensity. "We are going to let them pour their secrets into that pit, and then we are going to make sure the world is watching when the whole thing comes crashing down on them, legally, financially, and permanently." Arya looked back at the screen, at the red zones on the heat map that signaled impending collapse. For 3 years, she had been the woman who fixed things for Cameron, the one who smoothed over his mistakes and held his world together. Now, she was the one who saw the truth. She wasn't just his ex-fiancé anymore, she was the architect of his ending. She reached out and covered Min Hyuk's hand with her own, feeling the strength of his ink-stained skin against hers. The man the world called a monster was the only one standing with her to prevent a catastrophe, while the hero of the city was ready to build a monument to his own greed. "I can pull the digital audit logs," Arya whispered. "I can prove the materials are fraudulent before they even break ground on the spire." "Do it," Min Hyuk commanded. "Build me the evidence, Arya. I'll handle the demolition." In the quiet of the fortified estate, surrounded by the infrastructure of power, Arya Beaumont began to type. Every keystroke was a nail in the coffin of her old life, and every line of code was a vow to the man who had seen her worth when she was nothing but a prop in a burgundy dress. The skyline was a jagged promise of gold and glass, but at the edge of the city, the air turned salt-thick and heavy. Min Hyuk had insisted on a temporary escape from the claustrophobic hum of the drafting studio, bringing Arya to a private pier he owned on the Hudson. The evening was supposed to be a reprieve, a quiet dinner on the deck of a sleek, obsidian-hulled yacht. For the first time, the talk wasn't of load-bearing columns or fraudulent steel, but of the music Arya loved and the childhood Min Hyuk had survived in the backstreets of Seoul. Arya sat wrapped in a heavy wool coat Min Hyuk had draped over her shoulders, her fingers warming around a glass of deep red wine. The light from the pier's vintage lanterns cast a soft glow over her warm brown skin, and for a fleeting moment, the terror of the fundraiser felt like a lifetime ago. Min Hyuk sat across from her, his usual impenetrable mask softened by the moonlight. He had begun to tell her about the lotus tattoo behind his ear, a symbol of rising from the mud, when his posture suddenly went rigid. The change was instantaneous. The soft, resonant baritone of his voice vanished, replaced by a low, predatory stillness. He didn't look at Arya. His gaze was fixed on the shadows of the shipping containers lining the wharf. "Stay behind the bulkhead, Arya," he commanded, his voice barely a whisper, yet vibrating with an authority that brooked no argument. "Now." Before she could ask why, the silence of the harbor was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic crack of gunfire. Sparks flew off the yacht's chrome railings, and the glass of the cabin shattered into 1,000 diamond-like shards. Arya scrambled to the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her eyes remained locked on Min Hyuk. He didn't scramble. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace that suggested he had been born for this chaos. From a holster Arya hadn't even noticed, he drew a matte black handgun. He didn't shout for his security detail. He was the security detail. 3 figures emerged from the darkness of the pier, dressed in tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas. They were a rival syndicate's hit squad, sent to decapitate the Dragon of Seoul while he was vulnerable. They hadn't realized that for Min Hyuk, vulnerability was a trap. Min Hyuk vaulted over the dining table, using it as a temporary shield. He fired twice, 2 sharp, clinical pops. The lead gunman crumpled before he could even register Min Hyuk's position. The second attacker dived behind a crate, but Min Hyuk was already moving, his silhouette a blur of dark wool and lethal intent. He didn't just fight, he dismantled. When the third man charged, swinging a heavy iron pipe, Min Hyuk didn't retreat. He stepped into the man's guard, his ink-stained hand catching the attacker's wrist with a sickening crunch. With a swift, brutal pivot, Min Hyuk drove his elbow into the man's temple and followed with a sweep that sent the assassin crashing into the freezing water of the Hudson. As the echoes of the gunfire died down, a fleet of black SUVs screeched onto the pier, Min Hyuk's men swarming out to secure the perimeter. But the danger had already been neutralized. Min Hyuk stood at the edge of the pier, his chest heaving slightly, the dragon on his neck appearing to pulse in the flickering light of the lanterns. He holstered his weapon and turned toward Arya. The lethal fire in his eyes didn't vanish, but it shifted into an intense, burning protectiveness. He reached her in 2 strides, his hands, still warm from the exertion, cupping her face. He checked her for injuries with a frantic, silent thoroughness that made Arya's breath catch. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones. "I'm fine," Arya whispered, her voice trembling not from the gunfire, but from the raw power radiating off the man in front of her. She looked at his hands, seeing the ink-etched knuckles that had just fought for her life. "Min Hyuk, you could have been killed." "They made the mistake of thinking you were my weakness," he murmured, leaning his forehead against hers. His scent, sandalwood, gunpowder, and sea salt, enveloped her, grounding her in the aftermath of the violence. "They didn't realize that you are the only thing I am willing to burn this entire city down to protect." Arya looked past him at the fallen men being dragged away by his silent soldiers. This was the world she had entered, a world where peace was a luxury and safety was earned through blood. Cameron had offered her a life of polished lies and public shame. Min Hyuk offered her a dangerous truth and a protection so absolute it was terrifying. She reached up, her small hand covering the dragon tattoo on his neck. The skin was hot, his pulse thundering beneath her palm. In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of a romantic evening turned battlefield, Arya realized she wasn't just his engineer or his ghost. She was his heart, and the dragon was never more dangerous than when he was guarding his own. "We need to get back to the estate," Min Hyuk said, his voice regaining its cold, commanding edge. "They've tipped their hand. They're scared of what you're finding in those blueprints, Arya. They aren't just trying to kill me anymore. They're trying to stop you." As he led her toward the waiting car, shielding her body with his own, Arya felt a new kind of resolve. They had tried to break her foundation once before. They wouldn't get a second chance. The dust didn't settle. It hung in the air like a thick, pulverized shroud of concrete and shattered dreams. The Sterling Price waterfront site, once a symbol of Cameron's soaring ambition, was now a jagged landscape of twisted rebar and groaning steel. Arya stood at the perimeter, her lungs burning from the grit, her eyes searching the wreckage for the obsidian-black SUV that had been crushed when the upper tiers of the parking structure suffered a catastrophic shear. Min Hyuk was underneath that mess. He had gone to the site to personally confront the corrupt foreman with the evidence Arya had uncovered, but the accident had happened too fast. The brittle, substandard composite columns she had warned about had finally succumbed to the vibration of the heavy machinery, pancaking the lower levels in a thunderous roar of structural failure. "Min Hyuk," she screamed, her voice lost in the screech of settling metal. The sirens were still minutes away. The site workers had fled in terror, but Arya moved toward the center of the collapse, her mind automatically shifting from panic to the cold, clinical logic of a structural engineer. She saw the SUV, or what was left of it. It was pinned under a massive grade 50 steel beam, the very fraudulent material that had started this nightmare. The beam was wedged at a precarious 45-degree angle, supported only by a fractured concrete pillar that was spiderwebbing before her eyes. "Don't move," she yelled, spotting a flicker of movement through the shattered glass of the car. Min Hyuk was alive. His face bloodied, his powerful frame trapped by the crumpled roof of the vehicle. One of his men lay motionless in the driver's seat. "Arya, get back," Min Hyuk's voice came out as a pained rasp. "The whole sector, it's going to go." "I'm not leaving you," she snapped, her eyes scanning the debris. She didn't have a crane or a hydraulic jack, but she had physics. She saw the way the weight was distributed. If she could create a temporary fulcrum using a discarded steel pipe and a heavy masonry block, she could shift the load just enough for him to crawl out before the secondary collapse triggered. She moved with a frantic, focused precision, her hands, the hands of a woman Cameron had called soft, hauling a heavy iron pipe into position. She jammed it under the main beam, using a chunk of the fractured pillar as a pivot point. "I need you to push when I say," she told him, her muscles screaming as she threw her entire weight onto the lever. The skin on her palms tore, blood slicking the metal, but she didn't feel the pain. She only felt the desperate need to keep the sky from falling on the only man who had ever truly seen her. "Now," she shrieked. Min Hyuk let out a guttural roar of exertion, his muscular arms straining against the collapsed roof. With the mechanical advantage Arya had created, the beam groaned and shifted upward by a mere 3 inches. It was a terrifying, precarious gap. "Out now." Min Hyuk dragged himself through the shattered window, his movement a blur of agony and survival. The second his boots hit the dusty concrete, the fractured pillar finally gave way. Arya dived back as the beam came crashing down, the force of the impact sending a shockwave through the ground that knocked them both flat. A deafening roar followed as the remaining portion of the parking deck finally surrendered to gravity, burying the SUV in a tomb of gray dust. For a moment, there was only the sound of falling pebbles and Arya's ragged breathing. Then, a heavy, ink-stained hand reached through the haze and pulled her against a chest that was heaving with exertion. Min Hyuk held her with a ferocity that bordered on desperation, his suit ruined, his blood staining her sweatshirt, but his grip was absolute. "You're insane," he whispered into her hair, his voice trembling with a rare, raw emotion. "You should have run." Arya pulled back just enough to look into his dark eyes, which were filled with a mixture of shock and a new, profound level of respect. "I'm an engineer, Min Hyuk. I know exactly how much weight a structure can take before it breaks, and I knew I wasn't going to let you break." He looked at the ruins of the building, the physical manifestation of Cameron's greed, and then back at the woman who had just manipulated gravity to save his life. The dragon of soul had been saved by the architect he had rescued from the rain. "They tried to bury us," Min Hyuk said, his voice regaining its cold, lethal edge as the distant sound of sirens finally reached them. He touched the dragon tattoo on his neck, his eyes fixed on the smoke rising from the site. "But they forgot that you know how to build things that last, and I know how to destroy the things that don't." As the emergency lights began to pulse against the dust-choked sky, Arya stood beside him, her hand locked in his. The building had fallen, but their foundation was finally set in stone. The dust from the collapse had barely settled on Arya's skin before she was back in the sanctuary of the fortified estate, but she wasn't hiding. She was hunting. The warehouse disaster had been the final proof she needed, the physical manifestation of Cameron's moral rot. Now, with the raw power of Min Hyuk's digital infrastructure at her fingertips, she prepared to deliver a structural failure of a different kind. Min Hyuk stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette sharp against the rising moon. He had traded his ruined suit for a clean black shirt, the dragon on his neck appearing dark and restless in the low light. "The press is already calling it a tragic construction accident," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Cameron is on television right now, playing the grieving visionary. He's blaming the subcontractors." Arya didn't look up from her monitors. Her fingers moved with a lethal cadence, navigating through the encrypted layers of the Sterling Price offshore accounts. "Let him speak," she murmured. "The higher he climbs his pedestal, the further he has to fall." She had spent the last 3 hours weaving together the digital threads she'd gathered. She had the original, uncorrupted blueprints she had drafted, the fraudulent procurement orders for the substandard steel, and the bank transfers that proved the missing millions had been funneled into Cameron's super PAC. It was a perfect, closed loop of corruption. "I have the ledger," Arya said, her voice gaining a cold, triumphant edge. "I've mapped the flow of every dollar from the Sterling Construction Fund to the shell companies Cameron uses for his campaign ads. It's not just a fraud, Min Hyuk. It's racketeering." Min Hyuk moved behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. The heat of his touch was a grounding force against the clinical coldness of the data. "He thought you were a silent partner, Arya. He thought your brilliance was his property. Show him who actually owns the truth." With a final, decisive keystroke, Arya bypassed the last firewall. She didn't send the files to the police. They could be bought. She sent them to every major news outlet in the city, to the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force, and most importantly, she leaked the internal humiliation video Cameron's team had recorded at the fundraiser, but with a new audio overlay. His private phone calls discussing the kickbacks. The reaction was instantaneous. Across her secondary monitors, news tickers began to scramble. The miracle candidate was being dismantled in real time. On the live feed of Cameron's press conference, a reporter stood up, holding a tablet. Arya watched as the blood drained from Cameron's face. He looked at the camera, at the very people he had tried to swindle, and for the first time he looked small. He looked like the hollowed-out pillar that had crushed Min Hyuk's car. "It's over," Arya whispered, leaning back in her chair. "No," Min Hyuk corrected, his eyes fixed on the screen where the FBI was already shown arriving at the Sterling Foundation headquarters. "It's just beginning. He lost his career tonight, but he's going to lose his freedom tomorrow. And the world finally knows that Arya Beaumont is the one who took it from him." He turned her chair around so she was forced to look at him. The man the world feared was looking at her with an expression of such profound pride that it made her heart ache. "You didn't just survive the collapse, Arya. You demolished the man who tried to break you." Arya looked at her hands. They were no longer the hands of a woman who picked her battles over a burgundy dress. They were the hands of a master architect who had just cleared the site for a new life. The price of Cameron's betrayal had been high, but as she looked into Min Hyuk's dark, unwavering eyes, she knew she had gained something far more valuable than revenge. She had found a foundation that would never, ever break. 6 months had passed since the night the sky fell at the waterfront, but the Manhattan elite had a short memory for tragedy and an insatiable appetite for power. The grand ballroom of the pier was once again a sea of tuxedos and silk, but the atmosphere was fundamentally altered. This wasn't a campaign fundraiser for a man built on sand. It was the inaugural gala for Beaumont Architecture, Arya's own firm, backed by the formidable resources of the CO Group. Arya stood at the top of the grand staircase, her deep brown skin radiant against a gown of structured, architectural white. It was a dress she had chosen herself, sharp, elegant, and uncompromising. She was no longer the woman in the burgundy satin of a betrayal past. She was the most sought-after structural engineer in the tri-state area. Cameron Price was a name now associated only with headlines about racketeering and prison sentences, while the Sterlings were embroiled in a decade-long legal battle that had stripped them of their prestige. Arya scanned the room, seeing the same faces that had once watched her humiliation with bored amusement. Now, they looked at her with a mix of awe and calculated respect, but Arya only had eyes for the man standing at the center of the floor. Seo Minhyuk looked like a king amongst mere merchants. His black suit was a masterpiece of tailoring, and the dragon on his neck seemed to glow under the amber light of the chandeliers. He had watched her rise over the last half-year, supporting her from the shadows as she rebuilt her reputation, never once demanding that she shrink herself for his sake. Their contract had officially ended that morning, but as their eyes met across the crowded room, Arya felt a pull that no legal document could ever command. Minhyuk raised a hand, and the room fell into a practiced, expectant hush. He moved through the crowd with that same predatory grace Arya had grown to love, stopping only when he stood directly before her. 6 months ago, Minhyuk began, his low baritone carrying effortlessly through the silent hall, I witnessed a collapse, not of a building but of a spirit. I offered a transaction to a woman I thought needed a shield. I was wrong. He looked at her, and the raw, dangerous honesty in his eyes made Arya's breath catch. The death god of soul was gone, replaced by a man who was publicly laying down his guard. I didn't give Arya Beaumont her strength. I merely provided the site for her to build it herself. She has shown me that a true partnership isn't about one person protecting the other. It's about two structures standing together to withstand any storm. To the collective gasp of the room, the man who never bowed to anyone dropped to one knee. He didn't produce a transactional contract or a business merger. He produced a velvet box that held a diamond of such incredible clarity and weight that it seemed to hold the light of the entire city. Arya, he said, his voice steady yet thick with an emotion he had spent a lifetime hiding. The contract is over. The blueprints are finished. I don't want an auditor or a ghost architect. I want the woman who saved my life to share it with me. Will you marry me, not for protection, not for a name, but because we are the only foundation that matters? Arya looked down at him, her heart thundering in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She thought back to the rainy curb, the burgundy dress, and the feeling of being discarded like scrap metal. She looked at the man who had seen her genius and worshipped it, the man who had fought for her and let her fight for him. Yes, she whispered, the word ringing out like a bell in the silence. Yes, Minhyuk. The roar of applause that followed was deafening, but as Minhyuk rose and slid the ring onto her finger, the world outside the ballroom ceased to exist. He pulled her into his arms, his grip possessive and absolute, and kissed her with an intensity that promised a lifetime of fire. Outside, the New York skyline continued its endless cycle of construction and decay. But inside the pier, a new legacy had been born. Arya Beaumont was no longer a victim of the sky falling. She was the woman who had learned to reach up and touch it. Their partnership was no longer written in ink. It was set in stone, a structure built to last for eternity.